Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
This is Kinda Murdery Insomniac. Stories to stay awake by. Greetings, Insomniacs. What an unmitigated pleasure it is to find you with me, snuggled warm amongst the legion of the Bloodshot Eye. I'm your host, Zevon Odelberg. Thank you for deciding to be here. And welcome to Kinda Murdery Insomniac, Stories to Stay Awake by. We have a very special blood and horror-flavored confection here for you tonight, as we dive down a broken glass and twisted metal rabbit hole together, seeking the most compelling stories of human dysfunction, cruelty, and violence. As always, this is your chance to say, "Oh hell no," and run out of the classroom, clinging by your bitten fingernails to the ragtag belief that humanity is fundamentally, or at least mostly, good. I'll wait. Still with us? Excellent. I approve of your conclusions. The choices that follow hard upon them are yours alone. Tonight, sweet legion, I present to you Kinda Murdery Insomniac Greatest Hits, or perhaps better characterized as Most Horrible Happenings, or if you'll forgive the opposite meaning, Deepest Cuts, a dark, operatic, and very murdery collection of Insomniac's most grotesque, felonious favorites. In our very own bizarro Murderland, you'll hear about a mysterious and unidentified leather-thong strangler who may have been a member of the Manson family, who may still be out there killing, but who certainly will turn your kind hearts to dust. Next, you'll hear about cruel and brutal violence committed by a Grendel of a man who murders his wife and finds himself contending with the vengeance of a horde of angry woodsmen. Our third story is grim and convoluted indeed. It's a tale of a sexually psychotic Berkeley accounting student whose unspeakable actions stain Northern California's wilderness. If that doesn't sound bad enough, story number 4 features a hulking, confused simpleton and the grimmest of wanton crimes, child murder. Chapter 5 opens with a tale of heroism brought to me by one of Insomniac's listeners, and I'll tell you about an important charity, the Hunter Lopez Memorial Foundation, which I hope you will consider donating to. Following on that comes the story of a hideously callous and selfish man who could not be more different than American hero Hunter Lopez. The 6th chapter of Insomniac Most Horrible Happenings features a beloved disabled transient accused of pedophilia and murdered by an avenging vigilante gang. But was it really vengeance? Did the disabled man truly hurt children? The answers may surprise you. Insomniac's 7th lament features the ravager of elderly RV owners. And our 8th story brings you a son drawn to crime like a werewolf is drawn to the moon. It feels wrong to say, "I hope you enjoy the show," but, dear Legion, please do know that Kinda Murdery Insomniac would never judge you if you do. Now, whether you're a new listener or a fan of our regular show, heed this warning. Insomniac is a different, darker kind of murdery. These are stories of true, unadulterated human evil. They are grim. They are tragic. There will be no laughter here. Insomniac features tales that may keep you up at night, that may make you feel like you need to take a shower or burn some sage or scream or do whatever your heart and mind demands of you as you try to wash away the grime of unforgivable violence. These stories are not appropriate for children. They are not appropriate for adults. They ought to have no place in our collective human story, and yet, here they are. And here we are. I'm your host, Zevon Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery Insomniac. You've been warned. Tonight is Thursday, October 28th, 2021. In keeping with the theme of this season, we remain in the Emerald Triangle, this time in Mendocino County, in the town of Ukiah. Much of this narrative is taken directly from the Ukiah Daily Journal, from a letter to the editor written by one George Dorner on November 14th, 2017, and then updated again on August 23rd, 2018. But you don't have to take Mr. Dorner's word for it. I've independently researched primary sourced newspaper articles from the time in question to ensure that Mr. Dorner's recounting of events hews to the facts. We may occasionally do a small amount of supposing here on Kinda Murdery Insomniac, but given the gravity of the stories we tell, we promise to carefully consider both facts and suppositions, and to present both with the seriousness that the events in question demand. Tonight's Insomniac features a cold case that remains unsolved. It's known as the Ukiah murders, or to a lesser extent, the Ukiah Strangler. The facts of the case are the facts. The suppositions revolve around whether or not the Ukiah murders may in fact be another heinous entry in the terrible resume of the Manson family. First, a quick word on the setting of this Insomniac's nightmare. Ukiah, and its population of approximately 16,000 people, is the county seat and the largest city in Mendocino County. It's situated on the 101 highway, approximately 115 miles from San Francisco. Ukiah was first settled by John Parker in 1856 and named after an anglicized version of the Native American word Yokiah, meaning deep valley. Until 1870, if you wanted to reach Ukiah from San Francisco, it was only accessible by a 2-day stagecoach ride, and that coach left from the train depot that ended in Petaluma, California. Like many of the towns in the Emerald Triangle, much of the area surrounding Ukiah is rural. And also like its brethren, if you visit the right part of downtown, you'll find an Old West village frozen in amber, complete with false fronts, whitewash, and brick. Certainly, parts of Ukiah could be described as picturesque, but the town was bypassed by the 101 highway in 1965, and ever since then, Ukiah has been fighting, and gradually losing, a battle for modern relevance. Not that killers ever cared much for such things. Most of what you're about to hear is taken directly from the Ukiah Daily Journal, and a letter written by George Dorner in November of 2017. But I have also corroborated its veracity with an extensive review of primary newspaper articles published at the time of the murders. This is Kinda Murdery Insomniac, stories to stay awake by, and this is your last chance to exit stage left and escape to safety before the cavalcade of human depravity begins. Still with us? Good. Here we go. The story of the Ukiah Strangler takes us back just 3 years after the 101 decided that Ukiah was no longer a necessary destination. It's Monday morning, October 14th, 1968, when 8-year-old Johnny Ussery Jr. is awakened by his mother's alarm clock at 7:30 a.m. Little Johnny didn't find his mother in her bedroom. Her purse had been emptied on her still-made bed. She wasn't in their mobile home. He stepped out of the front door of their trailer behind Nancy's Antiques, and there he found his mother, Clyda Delaney, lying on the ground, her face as pale as her platinum blonde hair. Johnny knew immediately that his mother was dead. The horrified boy screamed and bolted into the trailer next door, seeking help from his great-grandmother, Nancy Warren. He found Nancy's dead body in her trailer. The television was on, the screen flickering snow. There would be no help from Grandma this morning. Johnny was a smart boy. He kept his head together. He exited the back door of Nancy's trailer and ducked into the back door of his home. There he roused Brett, 5 years old, and Lane, 4. Johnny dressed them and himself and led them out the back door to the neighbor's house, where he blurted out, "Mommy and Grandma are dead." The neighbors called the sheriff's office. Sheriff Reno Bartholomew led law enforcement to the crime scene at Nelson Ranch Road and Highway 101. Clyda's body had laid on a gravel walkway through a hard driving rain and was washed clean. The near-term expectant mother had been garroted with a leather bootlace, 36 inches long, double-looped about her throat and tied tight at the nape of her neck. She had been severely beaten beforehand. Her unborn child died with her, bringing the horrible death toll to 3. Nancy Warren had been garroted in the same fashion, a double-looped bootlace. She had been beaten even more severely than Clyda. Crime scene processing discovered fingerprints in Nancy's trailer that didn't belong to family members or first responders. The fingerprints went unidentified. There was also blood under Nancy's fingernails. $300 in cash remained in plain view in the trailer, and the only valuables missing seemed to be an elaborate jewelry box and its contents worth about $5,000, as well as change from a cash box. The jewel box had been in open view in a closet next to the $300, but the cash remained in place. The sheriff snapped into action. Over the next few days, he questioned 35 people. He investigated a trio of purse snatchers arrested the day after the murder, but with no luck. Later, there would be a report of a white 1956 Plymouth station wagon with paper license plates containing 3 men in front of Nancy's Antiques at about 8 a.m. on the morning of the murder. It left headed south on Highway 101 toward Hopland. A third report from a waitress in Hopland described a station wagon with 3 men in it. One was stocky, 5 foot 10 inches tall, in his early 20s, with average-length bright red hair. Another was also in his early 20s, medium built and had long brown hair. The third man was a husky 6-footer, with dark hair and a couple days' worth of scruffy whiskers. The waitress reported overhearing them say, "We'll get away with this the same as we did in Oregon." The connections between the double murders and these incidents involving 3 male suspects remain unknown. There were more promising leads in Clyda's murder. Only 24 years old, she was separated from John Ussery Sr., the father of her 3 sons. The divorce was an ugly one, with custody of the 3 boys in dispute. But John Ussery Sr. was quickly determined to have been in Eugene, Oregon at the time of the murders. Law enforcement declared him clear of suspicion. Clyda Delaney's new husband, California Highway Patrol Sergeant Donald Delaney, returned from a Sacramento training session in a CHP unit at 4 p.m. the day of the murders. He willingly gave a statement to the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office that evening. According to Delaney, the family had watched a Disney program on TV the night before the murders. At about 8:45 p.m., Delaney took Clyda and her sons to her trailer, dropping them off at about 9:30 p.m. He then headed off to his scheduled training in Sacramento. At the Route 20 turnoff, he realized he had forgotten his uniform. He returned to pick up the uniform from his apartment before turning around for Sacramento, signing in at the Highway Patrol Academy at 1:45 a.m. Monday morning. Does it seem suspicious that a CHP sergeant who happened to be out of town the night his grandmother-in-law, wife, and unborn child were murdered would have forgotten his uniform on his way out of town and returned home, creating a window of time during which, if his wife and stepchildren had fallen asleep early, he could have committed the murders? Apparently not, at least not in the eyes of Sheriff Reno Bartholomew. And certainly one would like to believe and should believe that Sergeant Delaney had much more regard for his young wife and unborn child than to murder them so brutally. Indeed, he was never really suspected, and Insomniac does not mean to cast any suspicion in his direction. In December of 1969, a little over a year after the murders, Sheriff Bartholomew's memory was jogged by TV coverage of the Manson family, mentioning that they had used leather thongs to garrote and tie up their victims. He recalled that on June 22, 1968, 5 of the Manson family women were arrested in Philo, California, along with 3 young men. An infant was taken into foster care. Both sheriff's deputies and the highway patrol were there for felony narcotics arrests. In fact, Charles Manson himself had been arrested in Ukiah a year earlier in 1967 over a dispute with the police when they tried to remove a 14-year-old runaway girl from his custody. No mention is made of the 3 men picked up with the Manson women in June of 1968. However, Mendocino court documents show that known Manson family members Susan Atkins, Ella Jo Bailey, Mary Brunner, Patricia Credwinkle, and Stephanie Gale Rowe were credited with service of 63 days in jail on a 60-day sentence for the felonies. They were released on August 16, 1968. At least 2 of the 5 were in Mendocino County still later than that. Atkins ignored her parole restrictions and was arrested. Mary Brunner had to return to Mendocino to reclaim her infant from foster care. Sheriff Bartholomew traded information about the Mansonites with the prosecutors in Southern California to no avail. There were too many possible suspects, and yet no motive. With 4 reports of trios of suspicious strangers, it is uncertain just how many unknown suspects there are. More than half a century later, the murders of Nancy Warren, Clyda Delaney, and Clyda's unborn baby girl remain unsolved. Amateur sleuths lurking in the comments of cold case articles on the internet do suggest a motive, however. They say there's a local legend in Ukiah. They say the hippie girl whose baby was taken away from her and put into foster care returned to take revenge on the family of the CHP officer that she held responsible. This has been Kinda Murdery Insomniac. Stories to stay awake by. I'm Zevon Odelberg. Good night. And a bleary-eyed good evening to you, Insomniacs. Tonight is Thursday, November 4th, 2021. And this is Kinda Murdery Insomniac. Stories to stay awake by. If you heard our last episode, then you know Insomniac is a different breed of Kinda Murdery. We cover the darkest tales that humanity has to offer. We're not here to make light. We are not here to giggle. We are here to uncover deep human depravity. This is your last chance to exit stage left and return to a life of warmth and delusion. Still with us? Good. Here we go. Tonight's Insomniac features a tale of maniacal violence as told in the Ferndale Enterprise on Saturday, August 15th, 1885. It takes place in the town of Blue Lake, in Humboldt County, in the far northern corner of the Emerald Triangle. The article is entitled, "Foul Murder. A Human Brute Cuts a Woman's Throat." The community was shocked yesterday upon the receipt of the news of a horrible double tragedy that occurred in the vicinity of Blue Lake on the day before. Briefly stated, a man murdered a woman in cold blood and was subsequently put to death at the hands of infuriated citizens. The story of the relations of the parties and the double crime is as follows. About a year ago, Henry M. Benner came to this county and located a quarter section of land a few miles beyond Blue Lake. Shortly after, he built a house and engaged Mrs. Amanda N. Town as a housekeeper. She was a fine-looking woman and had separated from her husband, having entered a suit for divorce in the Superior Court of Humboldt County. She brought 2 children with her when she came to Blue Lake. Benner abused her fearfully while she lived with him, and on one such instance was fined $30 in the Arcata Justice's Court for maltreating her. $30. That's about $848 today. Far too little, in this Insomniac's opinion. Soon after the beating, for which he was fined the inflation-adjusted $848, Amanda left Henry Benner and went to cooking in a logging camp on the North Fork of Mad River. Benner, being infatuated with her, visited her at various times and insisted that she should marry him. This she refused to do, and upon the occasions of his visits, Benner continued to abuse her, and at one time threatened to take her life. These persecutions became well known in the community, and the woodsman told Benner at the time that they would hang him if he visited her again. This caused him to cease his visits to Mrs. Town until the day of the murder. On Tuesday afternoon, having been to Blue Lake to sell his tan bark, Benner proceeded to Graham's logging camp, where the woman was working. Soon after, Perry Hill, a woodsman, heard the cries of a woman, but attached no particular importance to them. Nice work, Perry. That's sarcasm. Perry failed miserably, because when Mrs. Town's 2 children came home from school, they found their mother's dead body lying on the floor. The alarm was given, and those who went to the house found that Mrs. Town had been brutally murdered. Her face was beaten black and blue, and her throat was cut from ear to ear. Her hands were cut in several places to the bone, and everything bore evidence that she had made a desperate struggle for her life. She held the knife in her right hand. Benner had undoubtedly relinquished his hold on the weapon after seeing what he had done. He fled. The news of the murder was immediately sent to Blue Lake, where the assassin Benner was found and arrested. No one doubted his guilt. A coroner's jury was immediately summoned and an inquest held. The evidence was not direct, but the circumstances connected with the case, the blood stains on his hands and pants, and upon the shirt which he discarded for a new one, fully warranted the jury in bringing their verdict and charging him with murder. But even at this trying time, with the courtroom filled with excited people, Benner's gall did not desert him. He protested his innocence and stated that even though they hanged him, he would still swear his innocence. His bravado incensed the people who tried to make him confess. In pursuance of this end, he was taken to the logging camp and confronted with the body of his victim. But still, he denied the murder. After all efforts to make him confess failed, he was placed in the stage in the charge of Deputy Sheriff Gordon and Constable Maddox, and the party started on their return trip to Blue Lake. It was now about 9 o'clock in the evening, the murder having been committed about 3, and the night was dark and dismal, like this one, a true Insomniac's night. As the stage in which Benner was riding was going through the dark woods, suddenly there sprang forth more than 100 men and demanded the prisoner. The officers in charge refused to give him up, firing 2 shots in the air. But this had no effect. The officers were seized and laid on their backs and held there. Benner was then seized himself. A rope was fastened around his neck, and the mob dragged him about 75 yards. When 2 pistol shots were fired from the crowd. At this signal, the entire crowd vanished, and the officers arose, and taking the direction they had observed the crowd went, they found the body of Benner. He was still alive, but died in about 10 minutes. His body was taken to Blue Lake, where it was found that he had died of a pistol shot, the ball entering the right side of the stomach, below the lower rib, and then ranging brutally, destructively upward. The crowd that did the deed was made up of the woodsmen from the logging camps for miles around. So beloved was Amanda Town to those Emerald Triangle Paul Bunyans. The coroner's jury found that Benner was killed by an unknown party. Good riddance, says Insomniac. Sometimes justice must find a way. This has been Kinda Murdery, Insomniac. Stories to stay awake by. I'm Zevon Odelberg, wishing you sweet dreams. Welcome to Kinda Murdery, Insomniac. Tonight's blood-curdling, insomnia-inducing tale of human horror takes place in an unincorporated area called Wildwood in Trinity County, about 56 miles west of Red Bluff, and only a few miles from the tiny town of Patina, home to 13 souls. But our story does not begin in the brutal wilds of Northern California, but rather somewhere more civilized, and perhaps more humane. You be the judge. The story you're about to hear I discovered in 2 different articles from the San Francisco Examiner. The first from Sunday, July 24th, 1955, and the next from Saturday, May 16th, 1957. Hold on tight. This is a horror story of sexual brutalization and tragic murder. If you would prefer to cleave to your comfortable illusions and exit now, this is your chance. Still with us? Good. Our tale of violence and perversion begins in Berkeley, California, on a cloudy Thursday afternoon, April 28th, 1955. 14-year-old junior high student Stephanie Bryan fails to arrive home from her school in Berkeley. Stephanie, a shy, studious child, had just started to wear lipstick and was yet to have her first date. She was a ninth grader at Willard Junior High School. The school was a mile from her home at 131 Alvarado Road above the Claremont Hotel. She was the eldest of 4 children of Dr. and Mrs. Charles S. Bryan, Jr. Her father was a radiologist at Peralta Hospital in Oakland. Stephanie left school that day after gym class at 3:15 p.m., carrying a red purse and a French textbook. She walked toward home with a school chum, Mary Ann Stewart. Along the way, the girls stopped at the public library, where Stephanie checked out a novel, Sue Barton, Staff Nurse, and at a pet shop where she bought a 25-cent booklet on parakeets. From that point, Stephanie Bryan vanished as if into limbo. About 4:30 p.m., several motorists noticed a struggle between a young girl and a man in a Chevrolet sedan at Mount Diablo Boulevard, just east of the Broadway low-level tunnel, and 2 miles from the Claremont Hotel. But most of them mistook it for a family argument, and their reports to the police were noted only after Stephanie's disappearance was publicized. Other than the so-called Tunnel Road incident, there was only one clue. That was Stephanie's French textbook. It was found in the early morning of May 2nd, on the edge of Franklin Canyon Road, a cutoff running from Highway 40 near Pinole in the Central Costa Highway, which goes through Walnut Creek to Highway 50 at Dublin. Though the discovery furnished no immediate leads, the book's location became vitally significant later. Obviously, it had been thrown from a passing car. Despite mass searches and intense police investigation, there was no real break in the case until midsummer. Burton Wilbur Abbott enters our story on July 15th, 78 days after Stephanie disappeared. That particular evening, he was pan-broiling steaks in the kitchen of his rented home at 1408 San Jose Avenue, Alameda. Abbott was an accounting student at the University of California, Berkeley, 27 years old, slender and pallid, with blonde hair thinning at the crown, a fastidious dresser, personable at first meeting, intelligent, glibly talkative, and self-possessed. While Abbott studied accounting under the GI Bill, he was an ex-serviceman of sorts, his red-haired wife Georgia worked as a hairdresser in an Alameda beauty salon. Abbott did not work, but he contributed $178 a month in Army disability pension to the family income. He was a former tubercular, stricken ill a month before joining the Army in 1946. He had spent his entire military career in hospitals. Subsequently, his illness was cured by surgical removal of part of one lung at Livermore Veterans Hospital. He had been in good health for 3.5 years since then. Standing by while Abbott turned the steaks that evening were Georgia Abbott, their 4-year-old son Christopher, Abbott's mother, Mrs. Elsie Abbott, and Otto Desmond, a retired Navy warrant officer, and husband of Mrs. Leona Desmond, owner of the beauty shop where Georgia worked. Georgia went down to the basement to rummage for a costume hat. Moments later, she came pounding up the stairs greatly excited. She was holding Stephanie Bryan's red purse, which she had found in a cardboard box. Police were called without apparent objection from Abbott. Throughout the night, with policemen swarming through the house, Abbott affected a studied indifference. He worked a crossword puzzle while police questioned his wife. The next day, FBI men probed and spaded in the sandy basement, uncovering Stephanie's brassiere, glasses, library and parakeet books, and school composition notepads. Abbott professed surprise. He insisted he did not know Stephanie and had never heard of her disappearance, and had no idea how her belongings got in his basement. He submitted to persistent questioning, plus a lie detector test. The latter resulted in what police termed a, quote, textbook graph of a guilty man. Abbott had an alibi for the day of Stephanie's disappearance. His, quote, timetable alibi it was called because it accounted for his whereabouts minute by minute on April 28th. The young man seemingly had near total recall for one day, although his memory for intervening dates was no better than average. Abbott's alibi centered on his family's rustic vacation cabin at Wildwood in Trinity County, some 50 miles northwest of Red Bluff. He said he had left his Alameda home at 11 a.m. on April 28th, alone in a 1949 Chevrolet, and drove to Sacramento via Highway 40, then turned back there to Davis Junction at Highway 99 West, continued north to Red Bluff, and turned off there to Wildwood, arriving at the cabin about 8 p.m. The occasion for the trip, he said, was the April 30th opening of fishing season. Abbott was joined at the cabin early April 30th by his brother Mark and the latter's wife. They fished that day and the next and returned to the Bay Area Sunday evening, May 1st. Driving in separate cars on the trip home, the brothers went first to Mark's home in the Castro Valley, taking the Franklin Canyon Road and passing the point where Stephanie's French textbook was found the next day. The weakness of Abbott's story was that he could not corroborate it for April the 28th. Nevertheless, he was on firm ground at this point. The police could not disprove it entirely, and Stephanie Bryan herself was still only a missing person. Abbott's tale spurred police and FBI agents into a hasty search of Abbott's Wildwood cabin and the grounds around it. They dug eagerly, but they did not find Stephanie's body. When the authorities had given up, reporter Ed Montgomery and photographer Bob Bryant of the Examiner began a search of their own. They enlisted the aid of Harold Bud Jackson, a Trinity County woodsman, and Jackson's 2 bloodhounds. About dusk on July 20th, the dogs led the Examiner team to a mound of red clay on a rugged hillside across the road from the cabin, 300 feet from the front door. There, in a shallow, hastily dug grave, was the body of Stephanie Bryan, her skull shattered and her panties twisted around her neck. The undergarment was torn and twisted into a length of cloth and used to choke the breath out of her, contributing to the possibility that there may have been a sex motive of sorts, which resulted in Stephanie Bryan's ultimate murder. But whether the underwear noose was the murder weapon had not yet been determined. Heavy tools found near the cabin were also being examined, as Stephanie's skull had been fractured. Abbott was taken aback at this find. He was tearful for a moment before he recovered his composure. "It just can't be," he cried. "I can't understand how it got there. I don't know how it got there. I'm still staying with my story. I did not do it." That was to be Abbott's position in the months of waiting that followed during his long trial, and finally while the end drew near in Condemned Row at San Quentin. Officials who questioned Abbott after the body was found considered him strangely unaffected by a charge of murder. To one who urged him to confess for the sake of the Bryan family, Abbott replied, "I don't give a damn about the Bryan family. They mean nothing to me. When do we eat?" To another who suggested that Abbott was in serious trouble, Abbott said confidently, "A miracle will happen. Something has always saved me when I'm in trouble." Gasoline purchase receipts contributed in large measure to Abbott's undoing. One receipt, for example, proved that he had bought gasoline at 20th and Harrison Streets, Oakland, on April 28th, many blocks away from the route he claimed he took going out of town, and on the direct route to Berkeley. Another showed that on May 2nd, his first day back at UC after his jaunt to Trinity County, he drove far out Highway 40 to Tank Farm Hill. "Well, I was looking for tires," Abbott said, but the police believed he'd gone to Franklin Canyon Road. hoping to recover the French textbook carelessly thrown out of the car the night before. Through another receipt near Livermore on May 3rd, police discovered that Abbott had tried to get himself readmitted to the Veterans Hospital as a patient, although he was not ill. Police reasoned he was seeking refuge at the time. Abbott was quickly snared in a web of lies, which he lightly referred to simply as fibs and prevarications. One was his route to UC by automobile. Abbott first described a torturous roundabout way that kept him well clear of the Willard Junior High School. Later, he admitted he drove past the school daily on Telegraph Avenue and frequently visited Pring's Donut Shop half a block away. Stephanie also frequented the donut shop. Another was his detour to Sacramento on his April 28th trip to the cabin. He claimed at first that he stopped in Sacramento and visited a government land office. When he could not describe the building, Abbott amended his story. He had not stopped in Sacramento, but he had only driven through. Police believe he invented the Sacramento detour to account for his time in his alibi. His trial began in Oakland on November 7, 1955, before a jury in the court of Superior Court Judge Charles Wade Snook. Abbott was prosecuted by District Attorney J. Frank Coakley of Alameda County and Coakley's then-assistant, Folger Emerson. The defense lawyers were Stanley Whitney and Harold Hove of Alameda. Abbott bore the brunt of the many surprises that unfolded in the 2.5 months of courtroom battle. There was William Russell, a dour typewriter repairman who testified that Abbott was sitting in Pring's Donut Shop drinking coffee at 3 p.m. April 28th, an hour when Abbott claimed he was halfway to Trinity County. Russell said Abbott went out and started his car about the time that Stephanie was getting out of school 100 yards away. The prosecution argued that Abbott came to know Stephanie by sight while hanging around this teenager gathering place. This recognition acquaintance, they theorized, eventually made it easier for Abbott to get the girl into his car, either by ruse or by force. There was Mrs. Marion Morgan, an insurance underwriter who said Abbott's car sped through a red light in Berkeley at 3 p.m. that day, heading for the point where Stephanie was last seen. And there was Mrs. Reva Lediker, a stout housewife with an Alice in Wonderland hairdo who said she had seen the Tunnel Road incident. She pointed to Abbott and cried emotionally, "That is the man!" There was Dr. Elmer J. Shabert, the physician who operated on Abbott in 1951, pronouncing Abbott a man of unimpaired physical strength. He demolished Abbott's contention that he was too weak to have slain Stephanie and carried her body up a hill. Another was rough-cut Delbert Cox, the Wildwood innkeeper. He gave the lie to Abbott's story that he bought a drink at Cox's bar at about 8 p.m. on April 28th. Abbott didn't show up until April 29th, Cox said, and then he drank heavily. The sensation of the state's case-in-chief was graying, pipe-smoking little Paul L. Kirk, the UC criminologist. From his laboratory, Kirk produced many marvels, including testimony that Abbott's boots bore clay that matched the soil 9 inches deep in Stephanie's grave. Fibers in Abbott's car matched fibers from Stephanie's clothing. Human hair from the car was identical with Stephanie's. The floor mat in Abbott's car reacted positively to blood, although it had been washed. Cleansing tissue found near the grave was the same brand as that used by Abbott. Oddly enough, the defense's own criminologist, Lowell Bradford, testified later that he agreed with all of Kirk's findings except his identification of the hair. When the defense took over, Abbott was his own chief witness and the biggest defense liability. He argued, posed, sneered, laughed, answered evasively, and often as not, took the bit in his teeth while his lawyers tore their hair. For almost 4 days, he quibbled and sparred with Coakley, denying everything, telling, and then admitting little, quote, fibs. Besides Abbott, there were two important defense witnesses, a cook and a waitress from Red Bluff, who swore that Abbott had eaten in their restaurant about 6 p.m. April 28th. It would have cleared Abbott if they had been believed. Folger Emerson destroyed them in cross-examination, however, showing that the restaurant personnel records had been tampered with, that both were hostile to the police investigators, and that they had previously told different stories. The trial wound up with a deluge of new rebuttal evidence from the prosecution testimony that apparently removed any lingering doubts in the minds of the jurymen. Mrs. Leona Desmond, Georgia Abbott's employer, said Abbott was at her beauty shop at about 2:30 p.m. April 28th, 3.5 hours after Abbott claimed he had left Alameda. She was supported in this damning testimony by Mrs. Bessie Wells, a beauty shop customer who said she saw Abbott too. Beauty shop records were produced to prove the date. The final blow was delivered by Mrs. Alma Stiegel, a secretary in State Controller's Office of Tax-Deeded Land in Oakland. She said that George Abbott telephoned her office at 10:30 a.m. April 28th asking about a tax-deeded land in Trinity County. Mrs. Stiegel prepared a letter for reply but never mailed it because she swore Abbott himself came to the office and picked it up at 1:30 p.m. that day. Georgia Abbott took the stand to contradict this new testimony, as did Abbott himself, but by then the die was cast. Final arguments by defense counsel stressed that the state's wholly circumstantial case was full of reasonable doubt which should be resolved in Abbott's favor. Coakley concluded for the prosecution, picturing Abbott in impassioned words as a sexual psychopath who killed to satisfy perverse desires. The prosecutor ended with a broken-voiced reading of a half-finished letter from Stephanie to a friend found in Stephanie's purse. This hasn't been a very eventful winter, so I can't think of anything to say. The jury began deliberation on January 19, 1956, after hearing 106 witnesses in 48 trial days. The jury was out 6 days, finding Abbott guilty of kidnapping and murder and decreeing death on both counts. The jury foreman commented later that in voting for Abbott's execution, he felt no more compunction than, quote, in stepping on the head of a rattlesnake. Abbott's family steadfastly believed in his innocence. His mother particularly spent the months between sentence and execution seeking evidence to clear him. That search failing, the state closed its account with Burton Abbott yesterday, on Friday, March 15, 1957, when Burton Wilbur Abbott was killed by gas chamber. Tonight is Thursday, February 3rd, 2022, and to the Legion of the Bloodshot Eye, I say thank you for keeping me company in the darkness. I'm your host, Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery Insomniac, stories to stay awake by. Good evening, and welcome to Kinda Murdery Insomniac. I'm your host, Zevon Odelberg. Thank you for deciding to be here. I want to begin, dear Legion of the Bloodshot Eye, with a warning. Tonight's story is a truly heinous tale, one you would perhaps be better off remaining ignorant about. So if you would prefer to cling to your feeble illusions that all humans are fundamentally good, I suggest you turn this off now. This is your opportunity to escape the horror perpetrated by the Fort Bragg Forest Fiend. Are you still with us? Good. Here we go. This stomach-churning narrative of the murder of little Teresa Johnson by Thomas LeHue. here named the Fort Bragg Forest Fiend, is pieced together from 3 newspaper articles. The first is the Fort Bragg Advocate on Wednesday, May 29th, 1929. The next is the Mendocino Beacon, Saturday, July 13th, 1929. And finally, the Healdsburg Tribune on Friday, August 1st, 1930. This is Kinda Murdery Insomniac. Stories to stay awake by. And now, if you dare, follow me into the darkness of the Mendocino County woods, where a young life is snuffed out too soon. The brutal murder of little Teresa Johnson of East Mendocino has thoroughly aroused the people of this coast. They are waiting with patience, however, and confidence that Sheriff Burns will, in a brief time, bring the fiend to justice. Suspicion has pointed to Tom LeHue, 32 years of age, who has not been able to give a satisfactory account of where he was on the afternoon of the murder. Clothing of the child with traces of blood was submitted by Burns to E.O. Heinrich, scientific criminologist of Berkeley. Clothing of LeHue was also submitted, and it is understood that blood traces were found on it. Further than this, nothing has been given out by the authorities. Comparatively little is known about LeHue, who has been residing in the East Mendocino section for about a year, and who had lived in Southern California. Reports have it that he is slightly unbalanced mentally. Late Wednesday afternoon of last week, 7-year-old Teresa Johnson left the East Mendocino schoolhouse in the company of a little playmate and school companion named Marley Fox. These children walked along the roadway, carefree and happy, for half a mile or more until their paths separated, and this little girlfriend, Marley Fox, aside from the murderer, was the last to see Teresa Johnson alive. The 2 children apparently separated somewhere around 3 o'clock. Little Teresa was accustomed to arrive home before 4 o'clock, and after waiting a reasonable time, thinking she had probably been delayed along the way to play or gather flowers, her father started out after her. He failed to find her along the road or at the schoolhouse, so he then sought the help of his neighbors, and an alarm was sounded throughout the community that the child had disappeared, and practically everyone in the section turned out to search for her. When no immediate trace of her was found, a telephone appeal was made to Mendocino for help, and the telephone office there spread the alarm. And this call for searchers was immediately met, and in a half-hour's time, 150 people were on their way to East Mendocino by automobile. Clarence Nix, principal of the Mendocino school, who was in charge of the Boy Scouts, took all of his available scouts, and the prairie section from the branch road where the little girl left her playmate was soon being combed by searchers. Reverend Spaulding, with a band of Boy Scouts from here, also went down and joined in the search. Even with this massive effort, it took some time before definite trace of the child was found. Her footprints were followed down the branch road leading to her home for a quarter of a mile or more, and then apparently she left the roadway and entered a brush-covered area. Finally, about 8 o'clock in the evening, her lunch bucket was found. Her little coat was carefully folded and held under the handle of the bucket, apparently as she had started out from school with it. Discovery of the lunch bucket caused the searchers to redouble their efforts, and within a few minutes after it was picked up, the body of the child was found, lying across a small log, face downwards. The body was found by Mr. Nix, and James Cleary. Examination showed the little girl to be dead. Her limbs were already set and stiff, indicating she had been dead for some hours. A first examination of the child revealed marks at her throat. While those first viewing the marks were not prepared to say just what caused them, they were confident it was not the work of an animal. A later and careful examination made by Sheriff Burns, who arrived here from Ukiah about 10 o'clock that evening, and by the autopsy surgeon and others, points quite conclusively to strangulation. Evidently, the throat was gripped in a powerful hand, and the child strangled as the marks on the throat showed that the fingers gripped on one side and the thumb on the other. Stuart Johnson and wife, the heartbroken parents of the little child, have been residents of the East Mendocino section for something like a year. The father is a native of Ohio and attended the State Agricultural College there. When World War I broke out, he went overseas with the 23rd Engineers. He served 18 months in France and saw some hard fighting and was shell-shocked. While in France, he met Mary Ledoux, a French girl, and after returning to the United States and regaining his health, he went back to France and claimed her as his bride. They selected California for their home and finally located at their present residence. Johnson has been making good with a small truck garden and with poultry. And with their 2 children, Teresa and a younger daughter 2.5 years old. They had been quite happy in their new location. But then along came tragedy, and the mother, never overly strong, is prostrate from the blow, while the father has aged materially from the strain. The inquest was held Sunday evening, and Coroner William Ornbaum's testimony stated that the child had been criminally assaulted and strangled to death. In hopes of receiving some clemency due to a plea of insanity, giant woodsman Tom LaHue has given the following full confession of his guilt. I got up about 5:45 in the morning and took care of the chickens and had breakfast at about 7:30. Then I got ready and went with my father to work. We loaded up a load of wood and hauled it up to the house about 11 a.m., and I sawed it up. I worked until about 1 p.m., then I had dinner. Then I went in the house and finished a story which I was reading in a magazine. Then I went out and fed the chickens and gave them some greens. Dad and Mother were working on a chicken fence when I left the house. I went down through the oat field to where we've been chopping wood in the morning. I did not have a watch with me when I left the house. I went down to where we'd been chopping, and then I went around Johnson's fence on the outside of the property, going east toward the main Willits Road. I also went around the wire fence on the south side and the property owned by Mrs. Reckwig. I did not cross through any wire fences, but went around them. Part of the time I was on the old road, and part of the time I was not. I went up to where Teresa Johnson's body was found, and I waited there about 10 minutes before she came along the road. I do not remember seeing her put the lunch bucket, sweater, and book down. I was there not more than 20 minutes altogether until I returned to where I had been chopping brush. I did not take hold of the little girl where she left her lunch bucket, but over by the log where the body was found. I don't remember what happened then, as my mind seemed to be dazed. I never followed the old road back, but walked along through the brush. I returned to where I'd been chopping brush earlier in the day and worked there until I returned home in the evening at about 6:20 p.m. I have not been made any promises by the sheriff or any of his deputies. Deputy Sheriff Al McCabe having said I was insane, I would be treated right. I have not been abused or used rough by the sheriff or any of his deputies. So he was in a daze, huh? Here, is an excerpt from what the judge had to say to Mr. Tom LaHue on the day he was convicted. You have been fairly tried and justly convicted upon evidence that admits of no possible doubt of the most heinous and revolting crime that has ever been perpetrated in this or any other county. You not only brutally throttled to death an innocent and defenseless child, but you also satisfied your abnormal animal passion upon her prostrate body. It is impossible for me to understand how any normal person who calls himself a man could become so depraved and commit such a cowardly and dastardly crime. Your brutal assault and murder sent to a premature grave a child who had never harmed any person in the world and who doubtless never had an evil thought. A child of so much promise, whose entire life was before her. You have also brought untold mental and physical suffering upon the child's invalid mother and heartbroken father. My sincere sympathy goes out to them. You, without cause or provocation, cruelly murdered the child and left her mutilated body in the woods to be preyed upon by the beasts of the forest. You fled from the scene of your crime like a thief in the night with the blood of an innocent child upon your clothing, and, as the cunning hypocrite that the evidence shows you are, you joined the searching party under the pretext of looking for this murdered child, when you knew that you had cruelly murdered her, and knew where her body lay. You also committed perjury of the rankest kind in this case. The jury did not believe your testimony, and I did not believe it. It was false and fabricated from beginning to end. I have not the slightest doubt of your guilt, and I doubt whether any unbiased person who heard the testimony could doubt your guilt at all. The jury should be congratulated for meting out to you the punishment which you so richly deserve. Whatever I might say to you would be of no assistance to you, and my advice to you is to make your peace with your God, if that is possible. And I say again, if the crime you have committed be one that can be forgiven by the Almighty, my advice to you is to seek forgiveness. Bailiff, take the defendant. On August 1st, 1930, barely more than a year after he crushed the life from young Teresa Johnson, at San Quentin Prison, Thomas LaHue, now 33, refused all religious rites and hung from the neck for 13 full minutes until dead. I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery Insomniac. Stories to stay awake by. Hey everybody, before we get started tonight, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about a cause that's important to me, and that I hope will be important to you too. This is a cause that was brought to my attention by listener Andy Traylor. I'm talking about the Hunter Lopez Foundation. Hunter was Andy's son's best friend and a fellow Marine who was killed at Abbey Gate, Kabul Airport in Afghanistan on August 26, 2021. Andy's son was with Hunter at the time. He received a gunshot wound and shrapnel in his leg. Hunter's injuries were obviously much worse. He died that day in Kabul. When you are considering giving to a 501c3 or donating to charity in the future, I hope you will consider donating to the Hunter Lopez Foundation, which is run by his parents, amazing people with huge hearts that just want to help others in the name of their fallen son. You can donate at hunterlopezmemorialfoundation.org. And now that I've taken a moment to tell you about a hero who gave everything for others, it's time for tonight's Insomniac and the story of a monster who didn't care one bit about others at all. Good evening, dearest legion of the bloodshot eye, and welcome to Kinda Murdery Insomniac, stories to stay awake by. I'm your host, Zevon Odelberg. Tonight, I take you further north to Portland, Oregon, for a story I discovered in the North County Times on Wednesday, October 30th, 1991. This is a short tale, but one so stomach-churning, I could not sit with it by myself, and so I ask your forgiveness for sharing it with you. I imagine you'll have even more trouble sleeping tonight than usual. A 27-year-old man has been sentenced to sexual abstinence for 5 years and house arrest for 6 months for knowingly spreading the AIDS virus by having sex with a girlfriend. Alberto Gonzalez, who was accused of infecting 23-year-old Bridget Peterson, pleaded no contest Monday to third-degree assault, a felony, and 2 misdemeanor counts of recklessly endangering others. Prosecutors dismissed 9 other charges, including a count of first-degree assault that alleged Gonzalez used a dangerous weapon, the AIDS virus, to intentionally inflict serious injury. David Peters, the deputy district attorney who prosecuted Gonzalez, said Tuesday he would have been able to show that Gonzalez knew he carried the virus when he began his relationship with Peterson. Sean Hopp, a previous girlfriend who would have been a key witness for the prosecution, said she and Gonzalez both discovered that they were AIDS-infected in 1988. He intentionally kept Girlfriend 1 and Girlfriend 2 from ever meeting, Peters said. He consciously kept the second one from getting the information she would have needed to protect herself. Peterson has said she met Gonzalez in 1989, and that they found out they were both HIV positive when they visited a plasma center last year. She later went to authorities to complain about other domestic problems involving Gonzalez. Police then learned of the circumstances under which she was infected. Both women said they fear Gonzalez has infected others. They said he frequented nightclubs and often made advances toward other women, even during his relationship with them. Peterson remains in good health. Gonzalez told Multnomah County District Judge Janice R. Wilson that he suffers slight symptoms of AIDS. The third-degree charge accused him of causing injury recklessly and with extreme indifference to human life. Extreme indifference to human life, indeed. This short column from 1991 is one of the most heinous stories I have read. I imagine you feel as sick as I do. Good luck falling asleep tonight, and with yet another human malediction, I leave you. I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery Insomniac. Stories to stay awake by. Good night. Good evening, sweet legion of the bloodshot eye. Tonight, I bring you a memory of Hawkins Bar in Trinity County, California. This is a hideous saga of murderous misfortune and revenge gone terribly wrong. There's a lot happening right now, I know, and if your nerves are raw, I suggest that you step away. But if you'd care to join me on this tour of human darkness, then please do, as I share with you a story printed by the Fort Worth Star-Sunday Telegram on November 15th, 1992, 30 years ago. This is the tale of poor disabled Gary Summer, whose awkward gait earned him the nickname Hop. Gary was a longtime transient, universally liked by family, friends, and bartenders across the Emerald Triangle, from Arcata to Weaverville. Summer's life was hard, and it ended harder when, as a cover for their theft of his Social Security disability money, a gang of self-styled vigilantes, who were in truth little more than ruthless drug-addicted outcasts, accused Hop of pedophilia, and then took their revenge. The small disabled man was beaten mercilessly, horrifically tortured and brutally killed by a team of bizarro avengers whose sadistic devilry made them nationally notorious, known across the country as the Hawkins Bar 8. That's right, this small-statured, disabled man was beaten, tortured, and murdered by 8 adult humans. I wish that I could say that calling his killers human was a kindness they did not deserve. But in all my studies of humanity, I have learned that there's nothing quite so human as terrible violence and rage. When they found Gary Hop Summers' crumpled body up on the mountain, sheriff's deputies first thought that animals had been picking at it. A closer look revealed a more terrible truth. Summer had been stabbed more than 70 times before his short, bent body was dumped in the shallow grave where a woodcutter found it 4 days later. In the months that followed the discovery, 8 people, 5 men and 3 women, were charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit the October 2, 1991 slaying that local newspapers described as a vigilante-type killing. Prosecutors say Summer, a 37-year-old wanderer with deformed legs and a limp, was killed in a horrifyingly vicious way by people who believed that he had molested the 5-year-old daughter of one of the defendants. These are the words of Special Prosecutor Robert Maloney. They did all they could to demean his body before he died. The victim apparently died while defendants were in the process of administering punishment. That was fortuitous for him as it shortened his suffering. Defense attorneys for the Hawkins Bar 8, so named after the mountain town where Summer lived in a trailer park by the Trinity River, say that prosecutors do not really know who killed Summer, and are trying to pressure people to talk by charging so many. Said defense attorney Joanna Carell, "I think they believe there were a lot of people there drinking and instigating and encouraging. I don't think they know who did what, and they decided to charge as many as they can and see what shakes down." Now the defendants are sitting through a string of pretrial hearings in a red-walled 19th century courthouse where many of the lawyers wear cowboy boots, and the county's gold rush past is not entirely remote. For Trinity County, a sparsely populated slice of mountainous paradise between Eureka and Redding, the case is the first death penalty trial anyone can remember. The trial is also by far the most expensive ever conducted in the county. $500,000 so far, and climbing. The defendants make up 1/4 of the jail's population. When there are pretrial hearings, Superior Court Judge John Letton must respond to motions from 10 defense attorneys. In a county with a depressed logging industry, an unemployment rate close to 13%, and welfare rolls that include more than 1/7 of the population, the crime court's cost alone are cause for anger. The state has agreed to pick up the tab for the trial, but that does not mollify everyone. Instead of due process, some people would simply like to see the defendants strung up. "It's not like the city up here," said one logger at a Weaverville bar. "They're used to it down there. We're not. Nothing like that has ever happened up here." Years ago, he said, some folks would pick on some hippies and give 'em a bad time on a back road and maybe cut their hair or scare 'em away, but they never put anyone in a grave. In the postcard pretty town of Weaverville, where the pace of life is slow and the mountain air is crisp, many residents condemn the killing, saying that the defendants took the law into their own hands. "There is a place for eye for an eye justice," said one artist who knew Summer. But he added that Summer was innocent and too giving, and then he got tried, convicted, and stabbed by vigilantes. Anyone even remotely involved in this should hang. Summer did not grow up in Trinity County, but he had lived for years about 50 miles to the west in the coastal town of Arcata. About 2 years ago, he lived in a crash pad near Humboldt State University campus in Arcata. There, Summer met a man named Bernard Bird McCarley, then 29. McCarley had spent 10 years in the California prison system for an armed robbery conviction in Los Angeles County and another 6 months in Humboldt County jail for an assault. Acquaintances said that McCarley, with an intimidating dominant manner formed by years in prison, was a heavy drinker and a drug user who became angry when he used drugs. Summer, whose limp and colostomy bag were because of birth defects, had various friends he stayed with off and on. In the months before his death, he shared a trailer in Hawkins Bar with McCarley and McCarley's girlfriend, Barbara Adcock, who lived there with her 3 children. Their 2-bedroom trailer was set on a hill above the U.S. Forest Service campground where Summer, McCarley, Adcock, and others often spent hours partying and drinking under a thick canopy of walnut trees. The grove was a few hundred yards from the gurgling, green-blue Trinity River. Adcock had lived in the area for years and had her own hard times. She scrounged the dump for aluminum cans to turn into money, and she brought back canned food that others had tossed in the dump. I think her whole life was filled up with drinking and being on the wrong side of things, a former neighbor said. In the period just before Summer was killed, one of his friends, Robert Jones, who was camping down by the river, said that it was pretty obvious that Adcock wanted Summer out of the trailer. "She wanted the trailer for her, Bird McCarley, and the kids," said Jones, who will be one of the main witnesses for the prosecution in the upcoming trial. Some weeks before he died, Summer hitchhiked to Arcata and saw friend Lisa Kennedy. In the past, Summer talked glowingly about Hawkins Bar, the sunshine and the parties. This time it was not going so well. He said, "I'm having problems up there. I've got to clear some stuff up. And then I'm coming back down." Kennedy said he was really depressed about it. I could tell. Several days before the slaying, Adcock reported to the sheriff's deputies that Summer had sodomized her 5-year-old daughter, according to pretrial testimony by Sergeant Dan Kirchner, the main sheriff's investigator on the case. Kirchner and Adcock's lawyer, Steve Carlton, differ about what happened. Kirchner says a subsequent investigation turned up no evidence corroborating Adcock's accusation. But Carlton, a former Shasta County district attorney, says that Adcock took her daughter to a local clinic and was advised that there was evidence she was, in fact, molested. Whatever version is accurate, animosity towards Summer clearly increased among the people who hung out down by the river. Jones said that Summer kept coming around to try to convince people that he had not molested Adcock's daughter. Later, Jones said that another man in the campground told him he had seen Summer in the back of a red truck being driven out of the campground, and Jones and the man told him that Summer looked dead to him, or he wasn't far from being dead. His face looked all messed up. To recount what happened next, the prosecution will rely in part on one of Adcock's children, a 10-year-old boy who prosecutors say witnessed Summer's killing on a remote logging road about 5 miles from the campground where he was abducted. The boy, who is under the care of the county foster care officials, has identified McCarley and 3 of the other male defendants as those doing the actual killing, prosecutors say. They add that the other 4 people charged in the case, Adcock, 2 women and a man, participated in the conspiracy to carry out the slaying. For their part, defense attorneys make it clear that they will attack the boy's testimony, pointing out that he has given sharply varying versions of events. In all the legal wrangling, however, no one is disputing that Summer died a tortured death. What was done to Summer is coldly, clinically detailed in court documents filed by the prosecutors. One of Summer's ears was cut off. One of his eyes was gouged out. He was struck repeatedly in the genitals, and several of his bones were broken. When his body was found, his pockets were empty and had been turned inside out. Just the day before the killing, Summer had gone to the bank and withdrawn several $100s in disability check money. The issue in the courtroom will be who killed Summer, and the focus will be on the defendants. These are homeless, nomadic people of their own choosing, one source close to the defense team said, who declined to be named. They are not an organized gang, he added, but instead a group that partied, drank, and did drugs together down by the river. They had a common bond of not conforming to what society finds acceptable. Being societal misfits, they didn't know how to deal with this molestation accusation. So it's the old macho thing. It matters that they thought he was a molester. Then things built up, they got drunk and loaded, and this was a heinous murder. What led to it? That's the question. After an autopsy, Summers' body was cremated and his ashes were sent to his mother in the Midwest. The mother told the coroner she heard from Summer once in a while, but she had not seen her son in 17 years. She added that he was, quote, a good Christian boy. Summers' friends say his killing is hard to reconcile with the man they knew, an inoffensive, gentle soul who made others happy. He loved his gin and tonics, beer, and marijuana, and he spent a lot of time in bars. There he would borrow small sums and pay back what he owed quickly. Describing his habits, friends flatly rejected the idea that Summer was a child molester. There wasn't a darn thing pretty about Hop, but his spirit just shined right through, said Donna Hammers, a bartender at Toby and Jack's Bar in Arcata, the Humboldt County town north of Eureka, where Summer lived on the street and in crash pads in recent years. He didn't have money, and he didn't have looks, he didn't have Jack. But he had such a positive attitude. We really loved Hoppy. He was a sweetie. As autumn takes hold of the mountains around Arcata, Summer's friends go up to Redwood Park on the edge of Humboldt State campus. There they have planted a spindly red alder in his memory. The tree is nestled up against some redwoods, looking a bit forlorn. At these gatherings, Summer's friends drink beer. They recall the candlelight vigil they held in the plaza in downtown Arcata after he died. About 100 people came. In this Insomniac's opinion, the testimony of family and friends, when joined with the timing of the beatings, torture, and murder, which occurred just a day after Summer had withdrawn hundreds of dollars from the bank, certainly seemed to suggest that the charges of molestation were trumped up to cover the robbery of a disabled man's government money. But I suppose we'll never know the truth. The truth we do know resides in the court documents. One of Summer's ears was cut off. One of his eyes was gouged out. He was struck repeatedly in the genitals, and several of his bones were broken. When the body was found, the pockets were empty and had been turned inside out. Just the day before the killing, Summer had gone to the bank and withdrawn several $100s in disability check money. These truths remain. I'm your host, Zevon Odelberg, and you've been listening to Kinda Murdery Insomniac. Stories to stay awake by. Good night. Good evening, dearest legion of the bloodshot eye, and welcome to Kinda Murdery Insomniac. Stories to stay awake by. I'm your host, Zevon Odelberg, and tonight I bring you a tale of elder abuse most foul. As always, now is your chance to turn off the show and avoid the upcoming tunnel of macabre and horrible truths. The stories you are about to hear are taken from the Santa Rosa Press Democrat, from 2 articles. The first published on Friday, November 16, 1984, and the next on Friday, September 15, 1995. These are not for the faint of heart, but if your heart beats steady, let's get to it. An ex-convict accused of killing 2 tourists on the Mendocino coast in 1982 will stand trial next month for a slaying in Oregon, according to authorities there. Robert Wayne Danielson, 38, formerly of Eugene, Oregon, will be returned to Mendocino County after his trial in Lane County. Danielson has been indicted by Mendocino's grand jury in the slayings of Benjamin Schaefer, 69, and Edith Schaefer, 62, whose bodies were discovered in a coastal ravine last December. The tourists from Yuma, Arizona had been shot execution style and their bodies dumped off Mountain View Road east of Manchester, according to the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office. The Schaefer's camper and personal belongings were later found in Reno, Nevada. Investigators said Danielson and his girlfriend, a 17-year-old runaway, met the Schaefers at a Mendocino County campground in July 1982. The girl reportedly told authorities that Danielson kidnapped the elderly couple, shot them both in the head, and disposed of their bodies before taking their camper and credit cards. Authorities said Danielson forged Schaefer's signature on credit card purchases in California and Nevada. Danielson is also suspected of 4 other slayings and 2 attempted murders in Oregon, Arizona, and Nevada in 1982. The suspect, who served 7 years in Oregon prisons for manslaughter, is accused of killing a 63-year-old fisherman at a campground in Oregon in June 1982. That fisherman was Arthur Gray of Springfield, Oregon, who was found shot to death at a campground in the Three Sisters Wilderness where he had been staying alone. Lane County Sheriff's investigator Richard Tracy said Danielson's teenage companion also is a witness to the Oregon slaying. She is in protective custody. Danielson's trial on murder charges in the Gray case is set for mid-December. Tracy said authorities in Mojave County, Arizona are also looking at Danielson in connection with the gunshot slayings of Harold Pratt, 60, and his wife Betty, 55, of Tucson, whose bodies were found at a campsite south of Phoenix in December 1982. He's also accused of killing Ernest Corral, 38, of Apache Junction, who was discovered shot to death in a desert ravine. Danielson is also a suspect in the attempted murder of Edwin and Ida Davis, both 64, of El Cajon, who were robbed and forcibly drugged at a desert campsite east of Las Vegas. To discover what became of the campground killer Robert Wayne Danielson, we turn once again to the Santa Rosa Press-Democrat on September 15, 1995, 13 years after the Schaefers were killed. Robert Wayne Danielson, the campground killer, was convicted of the slayings of Edith and Benjamin Schaefer in 1986, and quickly became the first person in 3 decades of county history to be sentenced to the gas chamber. He was arrested almost 2 years after the Schaefers disappeared from a campground near Manchester. His accomplice and girlfriend testified that she helped Danielson tie up the couple, then watched while he shot them execution style and stole their camper. Danielson, who had served time for manslaughter in an Oregon state prison, later was convicted of robbing and killing a man at an Oregon campground the same year. Danielson's mother also gained celebrity when she attempted to pass her son a loaded revolver as he walked through the Mendocino courthouse during his trial. Mary Ann Bishop, Mother Dearest, was convicted of abetting her son's escape attempt and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Danielson, who was transferred to San Quentin in 1986, was found hanging in his cell the morning of September 7th. He had fashioned a noose from a tube sock and was pronounced dead in the prison infirmary at 7:10 a.m. Mothers palming guns for their sons in courtrooms and nooses made of tube socks certainly qualify this Insomniac story as one of the more garish and sensational that we've covered. And now, dear Legion, before I let you go to your eyes wide open lack of restful dreams, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about my good friends Todd, Sean, and Nate from the Middle Aged and Creeped Out podcast. If you like your stories dark, and I know you do, if you like them paranormal, if you like them creepy, but you also like them family-friendly and just about as horrifying as 3 middle-aged guys from Indiana can handle, then Middle Aged and Creeped Out is the show for you. I love it. I think you will too. So please find Middle Aged and Creeped Out wherever you get your podcasts. It's a really fun show, but you don't have to take my word for it. Let's hear what the guys have to say for themselves.
Hey guys, this is Todd, Sean, and Nate, and we are from the Middle Aged and Creeped Out podcast. We drop full episodes every Wednesday night or Thursday morning, and our middle-aged mini episodes drop on Saturday afternoons at 3 o'clock.
And
And if you enjoy discussions about the paranormal, weird, unexplained, and just plain creepy, then check out our show. You can find us however you listen to your favorite podcasts. If you like what you hear, don't hesitate to give us a 5-star rating and review. Telling a friend, family member, or even a coworker about us helps the show.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Instagram by searching Middle Aged and Creeped Out. And our TikTok is @Mako Podcast, and that's with 2 A's.
Well, Nate, what do you think?
That's the end of our promo, and that's a wrap.
Well, there you go. So until next time, creepies, Nate is your sound engineer. We are your hosts, Todd and Sean.
And they are middle-aged and creeped out. Keep it creepy. That was middle-aged and creeped out. And this was Kinda Murdery Insomniac. Stories to stay awake by. I'm your host, Zevon Odelberg. Good night. Good evening, Insomniacs, and welcome to Kinda Murdery Insomniac. Stories to stay awake by. I'm your host, Zevon Odelberg. Thank you for deciding to be here. Before we get started with tonight's tale of brutal violence and familial rage, I'd like to say an extra special thank you to Darren Marlar from Weird Darkness, and to any members of the Weird Darkness Weirdo family who may be joining us. We're so honored and grateful to have you here. And wherever else you may be from, or if you've been with us all along, please know that Kinda Murdery is ride or die with you, too. Lastly, I'm in the Kinda Murdery woods of Tahoe, California for my daughter's spring break. And I've forgotten my pop shield, but there's no way out of this snowdrift. So if you hear me breathing heavily, maybe it's the details of the story, or maybe it's no pop shield. Thank you for your patience. One last thing before tonight's main event. I'd like to share with you a frightening, freezing, paranormal experience that I had during the blizzard of our first night's arrival in Kirkwood, California. Please note, this is audio verite. It was recorded in real time on my iPhone from inside the freezing cab of our rental car.
I'm sitting in a Kirkwood, California snowdrift. The two-wheel drive Mazda CX-Z was not equal to the task. It's getting very weird and dark, and frankly, kinda murdery, and colder, and colder. And I'm wishing now that I hadn't turned the car off, when suddenly I hear the sound of snow crunching beneath giant, bare feet. Is it the Sasquatch? Is it the Bigfoot? Is it the Yeti? Is it the abominable snowman? Honestly, even if it is, as long as he's warm, I just might give him a hug. This is Zevon Odelberg, signing off. Hopefully, not for the last time.
Now, Insomniacs, in the interest of honesty and transparency, I will share with you that those footprints did not belong to the abominable snowman. It was merely my grand uncle in snowshoes come to rescue me from the drift. But I am a child of Humboldt County, home to the legendary Bigfoot, and I promise you that the fear I felt was as real as I know the Sasquatch to be. And now, On to tonight's main event, a hideous recounting of a misnomer most foul. I give you the Nice Stabber. When a man lives in a trailer with his lover and her husband, one might expect him to be the victim, not the murderer. Or at the very least, it would be one of the three sides of that blighted triangle that found themselves murdered. That's what you'd assume. Not so in the story I'm about to tell. This is a tale ripped from the pages of the Santa Rosa Press Democrat that spans the towns of Nice, California in Lake County, which in this instance is better named Not So Nice, California, and Ukiah, California in Mendocino County, home to the awfully compelling and just plain awful murder of Frida Nash from Sunday's episode featuring Darren Marlar from Weird Darkness. I bring you a tale of familial rage from 1986. As always, now is your chance to duck out, turn off the show, and remain comfortably wrapped in your fragile illusions that mankind is fundamentally good. I'll wait. Still with us? Excellent. Here we go. The town of Nice in Lake County, California, was formerly known as Clear Lake Villas until it was renamed in 1930 after Nice, France, the original hometown of founding father Charles William Bain. Nice sits on the shores of the famed Clear Lake, and I imagine the locals call the California version Nice. So that's what I'll do here. We begin tonight's story with a woman named Joyce Simpson, a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church of Upper Lake, who ran what she called a, quote, guest home for the elderly, essentially a retirement home, next to a small house occupied by William Corliss Horn, 63, and his wife, Bernadine Ruth Horn, formerly Bernadine Ruth Vianne, 60. In the town of Nice, California, at 4:20 a.m. in the wee hours of the morning on Tuesday, June 17, 1986, Mrs. Joyce Simpson awakened to the sound of a woman's blood-curdling screams and repeated sobbing cries for help. Joyce Simpson, showing admirable courage, did more than call the police and cower in her home until they arrived. Instead, she boldly flew into the dark, murderous night to answer that desperate, screaming, crying woman's voice, the one that had awakened her. She quickly found her neighbor, Bernadine Ruth Horn, lying in the side doorway of the Horn home, sobbing, covered in stab wounds and blood, critically injured. When Joyce asked Bernadine if she knew who had done this to her, Bernadine answered simply, "Steve." When police and paramedics arrived, Bernadine was taken to the intensive care unit. Her husband, William Corliss Horn, was found in the house. He too had been viciously and repeatedly stabbed. But unlike his wife, William Corliss Horn was already dead. Which brings us to the obvious question: who is Stabbin' Steve? Forgive me for glibly nicknaming a murderer. I would offer my apologies, but also a simple reminder. You are listening to Kinda Murdery Insomniac, stories to stay awake by, and while I shall always endeavor to remain respectful, it's also important to remember that people of good conscience process the world's horror in different ways, and sometimes a touch of dark humor might be just the lifeline we need. While on the other hand, outrage and stern statements of condemnation, no matter how justified, act less like an emotional life preserver and more like a pillowcase full of bricks. You know your own heart, and you don't answer to the howling mob of homogenized morality, and public protestations of virtue often leave this insomniac wondering if the proverbial lady doth protest too much. But back to our story. In 1986, Nice, California was home to Bernadine Ruth Horn, 60, formerly Bernadine Ruth Vian, who lived with her husband, William Corals Horn, 63, and her son, Steve T. Vian, 24. They lived in a small, white, one-bedroom house on Crump Avenue in Nice, California, a house with immaculate pink shingles that they were trying to sell. The Horns had been married for about 6 years. Stephen had gained a new stepfather at the age of 18. 3 years prior to that, Bernadine Horn had inherited a tidy sum of $300,000, which she told her son she was leaving him in her will. Perhaps sharing that information with her offspring was a mistake, but since Stephen was an only child, were he inclined to murder his mother for money, it's likely he assumed he would inherit. Now every story needs an inciting incident, and in the case of the Nice stabber, perhaps that incident was the inheritance, or the moment Stephen found out about the inheritance. Perhaps it was the fact that the Horns were trying to sell their home. Perhaps it was just two parents who decided that their 24-year-old son was too old to be living at home in a one-bedroom house with his mom and stepdad. Whichever of those reasons, or perhaps all of them combined, was the first domino to fall, we cannot know for certain. But the true inciting incident likely occurred when the Horns told Stephen there was no longer room for him in their house. They kicked him out, and no matter how old, and particularly when a step-parent and a large sum of money are involved, a son is likely to feel his mother's rejection keenly. At his parents' urging, Stephen moved to Ukiah with the stated intention of attending Mendocino Community College, but instead, he wound up moving into a trailer with his girlfriend Teresa Peterson and her husband. Insomniac declines to speculate on how or why exactly that worked for them. A family friend, Lucy Anderson, pointed out that Stephen was jealously watching his mother and stepfather spend what he considered to be his. Remarking to Anderson when Mr. and Mrs. Horn took a trip to Hawaii, Stephen said, "They're spending my inheritance." Later, Teresa Peterson would tell the jury that Vian told her the day before the murder that if, quote, Bill, that's Stephen's stepfather William Horn, keeps spending my money on his coin and stamp collection, I'm going to effing kill him. Also, the day before the murder, Stephen went to his mother to ask for money, telling her the money was to buy food for Teresa Peterson's babies, who were Peterson's husbands and not Vian's. His mother told him that while she had loaned him money in the past, she couldn't do it anymore, but that he could ask her husband, Bill, for the money. Bill, unsurprisingly, refused. That same day, Peterson's husband loaned Stephen $3 for gas money. Oh my. Insomniac imagines that for Stephen, the humiliation was acute. That night, in the wee hours of the morning, wearing socks on his hands, Stephen Vian broke into his parents' house, grabbed a butcher knife from the kitchen, attacked Mr. and Mrs. Horn as they slept, and viciously murdered his stepfather, while very nearly murdering his mother. Within a couple of hours of William Horn's murder, portions of Horn's gold coin and stamp collection were found in Vian's car. Initially, Stephen Vian would plead not guilty to the murder of his stepfather, but once his mother recovered from the intensive care unit, Bernadine was prepared to testify against him. And facing such overwhelming evidence of his guilt, and perhaps more to the point, facing the death penalty if he were convicted, Stephen Vian would change his plea to guilty in exchange for life in prison without the possibility of parole. Of course, we also wonder why a killer kills, not just who or when or how, but especially we wonder why. In Vian's case, he wanted money, but bad enough to stab his own mother? He wanted gold coins and stamps? We suppose the answer is yes. And yet, was that all that was going on in Stephen Vian's mind? In what seems to this insomniac to be a case of broken psychological justification, Stephen Vion had convinced himself that his parents, in particular his stepfather, deserved to die. Bill Horn with his coin and stamp collections, the stepfather who hadn't arrived in Stephen's life until Stephen was 18 and therefore was never more than an interloper, the man who stole his mother's affection, kicked him out of the house, and was now effectively stealing his money, the same man who wouldn't loan him a penny to feed his girlfriend's infant children. Stephen no doubt convinced himself that he broke in to murder his parents with a butcher knife that June night in 1986, not just because he wanted, no, he needed money, but to avenge years' worth of slights, injuries, and wrongs done him by his mother and his stepfather. That's why he was robbing them. That's why he was stabbing them. Maybe not. In fact, it was revealed at Stephen Vion's trial that there were 2 prior felony convictions in Stephen Vion's very recent past. In October 1982, Vion was convicted of second-degree burglary, larceny, forgery, and grand larceny in Knox County, Tennessee. In 1984, he was convicted of escaping from jail in Davidson County, Tennessee. So perhaps this was less a case of a man horribly avenging himself upon parents who were spending his future on collectibles, as he no doubt believed, and more a case of an inveterate criminal who found himself getting arrested every 2 years, 1982, 1984, and unfortunately for Bernadine and William Horn, in 1986, Stephen Vion was living at home. I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery Insomniac. Stories to stay awake by. Sleep tight. And that was Kinda Murdery Insomniac. Greatest hits, most horrible happenings, and deepest cuts. I'm Zevon Odelberg. Good night.
Kinda Murdery Insomniac is created, researched, edited, produced, and hosted by Zevon Odelberg, with opening theme by Niall Madden and art by the Djinn of Leng. Available now on all podcasting platforms. If you like the show, please subscribe, review, and tell your friends. You can find us on social media at Kinda Murdery or email at kindamurdery@gmail.com.